Shawna Gray is a member of the Ceg-A-Kin Nakoda Nation in Treaty 4 territory and the homeland of the Métis. She's also a master's prepared clinical social worker with authorized practice endorsement. Shawna has worked in the rural public mental health system for 16 years. She and her husband have been vegan for 21 years and have 3 healthy vegan children aged 14, 12, and 9. They are a family of animal rescuers and currently reside with 4 rats, 2 cats, and 3 dogs. As an activist, Shawna is involved in social justice, animal liberation, and environmental justice work. She was formerly a country liaison for the Animal Save movement and is currently an organizer for Regina Pig Save, Save Movement Saskatoon, and Saskatchewan Climate Save. Shawna and her family recently began the process of planting a sustainable food forest on their lands in Treaty 6 territory. And thank you so much for taking this time today, Shawna.
Oh, I'm glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So, my generation were taught pretty much nothing about the First Peoples of what we call Canada when in schools and stuff. So, I'm going to apologize in advance for my ignorance and for asking you sometimes maybe to help me learn. And so, I'm interested in knowing something about the lands that you grew up on and, the kind of values that you were raised in regarding those lands and all the creatures that inhabited them.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, before we start, I should say I did not grow up on my own home reserve. So I grew up with connection, but I think there was a lot of people who were displaced because of residential schools and the legacy of residential schools. And I was one of those people.
Mm.
So a lot of what I've come to know about my culture has been a process of learning over the course of my life and kind of reconnecting back. In terms of the sort of connection with the land, I think that's exactly that's just a perfect way to say it, that it's about this interconnectedness with all things and this understanding of the world, um, where we can't be separated from it. We're a part of it, and the lands are a part of us, and we're a part of the lands. So I mean, the Nakota people weren't people who had like a single place that they lived. They were nomadic, and they knew a lot about all the lands that they traveled on historically. And I think that some of that's been lost, but some of it is still part of what we're teaching and learning about today.
Right. Okay. And so for us settler folks, Treaty 4, it seems like is southern Saskatchewan, kind of.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And then
Basically southern Saskatchewan, a tiny bit in Alberta, and maybe a little smidge in Manitoba. Yeah.
right. And then of course remembering that folks were nomadic, so the treaties were really a very colonialist imposition on defining territory. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And so Treaty 6,
Sure.
where now
Yeah.
you're creating a food forest, is actually kind of more over in Alberta territory, is it? Or
No, well, Treaty
no?
6 is yeah, it's in Alberta and Saskatchewan, and it's like a huge swath through the middle of both of them. So yeah, we're about 3.5 hours north of my home community, my reserve, Ceg-A-Kin.
Oh, cool. Okay. And why are they called Carry the Kettle? What's that reference?
That was a chief's name. Yeah, it was a chief's
Oh,
name at the time that the reserve was created. I mean, the reserve wasn't a voluntary system, of course, I'm sure you know. And actually, where our present reserve site is not at all where our traditional lands were.
right.
We tended to be more like what we would consider our traditional territory is more in the Cypress Hills area, which is kind of on the border of Manitoba and Saskatchewan in the south there. And of course, also with traveling and things like that as well. So my people were actually starved onto that reserve. Of course, you're probably quite aware of the bison slaughter that happened. The settlers were actually hired and paid to kill as many bison as they could so that they could clear the lands for agriculture and also of Indigenous people. There was a winter after this whole scale slaughter of the bison, which, I mean, this was unfathomable to Indigenous people of the time, that the bison could ever fully disappear.
Mm.
It was like, it was an impossible situation, unimaginable, but they did. And so people were starving. And ultimately, it was the rations offered by the Indian agents and the reserve system that got people to agree to go and be confined on these reserves.
I remember visiting
Yeah.
Head Smashed in Buffalo Jump in southern Alberta many years ago now,
Yeah.
but they showed, because it's Indigenous run, it's or at least it was at that time. So the people who were staffing the place were Indigenous, and so they would had their stories to tell, and they showed, there was a little video that they showed, and I don't know how they ever got this video, but this film of just some white guy sitting on a train with the open vista, but you were looking at the guy just sitting on this train cart, or what's it called, a train, like, one of the boxes, and going down the tracks and just shooting randomly out at the buffalo,
Yeah.
and then they just left them there to rot. I mean, that must have been devastating to those folks who, I'm sure the buffalo plays a role in stories and myths and legends, right?
Yeah, in our belief system, the bison are us and we are the bison. There's no separation. So we're interconnected in a way that I don't think most Western knowledge, ways of knowing, can understand, or do understand, or try to understand.
Right.
So yeah, it was a huge source of grief. And I think, like, almost like a loss of, like, who we were at the time, like, of course there were many losses of who we were at the time, many violations of our culture, and that are still ongoing. But that was a huge blow. Absolutely.
And I think really, if we think of ourselves as humans on this planet and the evolutionary process, my ancestors are from England, so I can learn about places like Stonehenge and some of the ancient burial mounds that date back to the Neolithic. Like that there are, I think all of our ancestors somewhere at some time had this connection to the land, but colonization has just become this rabid thing that, and most recently, of course, with North America. And I was thinking this morning about how, we can look at, like, we know that we have these ancestors because we can look at the ancient cities that they're finding in places like Mexico and Guatemala, and we can look at the pyramids, and we can look at Stonehenge. But a lot of, it feels like First Nations in this region, because they were nomadic, there's not really a lot of structures, right? And we can't point to structures and say, oh, look at what they did here. But I think about the ancient forests as kind of that is the connection, because there's culturally modified trees. And so now with Fairy Creek, I noticed that you posted something about the Fairy Creek blockade that's going on. And I've visited some of these ancient forests, and they really are, they're temples. And so it feels like destroying those forests is just this ongoing genocide and destruction of the heritage of the people.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And actually interesting to bring that up. In Saskatchewan right now, the same thing is happening in the north, and it's Indigenous people who are standing up and saying that taking down forests, or another thing that's happening is peat mining. So they're taking the peat moss out of the I guess the bogs or whatever. I'm not involved closely with it, but I've been reading lots about it. And it's the same thing. It's just totally devastating to people who were able to maintain a lot of the way of life after sort of colonization tried to destroy it.
Right. Yeah. So talk about trauma, hey? So your work
Yeah.
is involved with trauma and helping people handle it. And so a master's prepared clinical social worker with authorized practice endorsement. What does that actually mean?
So it's a lot of words for a very simple thing. I have a master's degree in social work. I actually went the thesis route and wrote a thesis called Holistic Social Work, Aboriginal Voices from the Field. And the authorized practice endorsement just means that I passed, like, a licensing exam so that I can, I have diagnostic privilege. I can diagnose using the DSM. Yeah, which
And
is new in Saskatchewan.
Yeah, and how do you feel about that? You know, I mean, I think that mental health issues are real and trauma is real. I personally have a problem with trying to attach labels, although I suppose sometimes that's useful.
Yeah, I think when it's useful is when I think it's important. Unfortunately, we still work within these systems that like to separate and label and pull things apart. And sometimes you can't access services unless you have a specific label.
Right,
So
right.
in my practice, the main time that I would use any of that kind of labeling would be so that people can get access to supports that are only available if you have said label. So
Right, right.
yeah.
And are you working mostly with Indigenous folks or all sorts of different peoples?
No, it's a mix. It's a mix. I live in a rural community, and I'm not living on in an Indigenous community, but there's a couple of Indigenous communities around here who get services in this area. So sometimes I'll have a higher caseload that includes Indigenous people, but it's a mix. So
Okay,
yeah.
all right. Well, good for you. And so we've got the idea of generations of trauma that First Nations people are living with, and then now you're also vegan, which invokes a whole new realm of trauma,
Right.
right? And so, what's your vegan story? When did you find the vegan path?
Well, I think it started around 1997, I would say. I was just finished my first degree, which was in psychology, and working in my first job, realizing that psychology didn't really open as many doors as I thought it would, and trying to figure out what I was going to do with my life. So I was on the internet of the time, which wasn't like the internet of now, but and I found this program, this chatting program called ICQ, and on that program I found lots of friends, and one in particular who is now my husband, Joran. And we started talking. Mostly, I think the interests that we had stated were like around fitness and things like that. And so we were talking about fitness, and that's kind of where it blossomed from. Because, of course, in fitness, one of the things that you um, focus on is the optimal diet, right? How to fuel yourself the best way. And that was when we both together collectively started to learn that our bodies really are not designed to digest animal proteins, especially not in the quantity that we're using them, or not just animal proteins, but animals bodies in general. And so that started a process, I guess, of inquiry that lasted a few years. I think most people have a story of sort of the layers of cognitive dissonance peeling away one by one, right? And of course, in my family, being vegan wasn't sort of normal. In fact, I don't know that they knew another vegan before I became one. So kind of some time with vegetarianism here and there and cutting out certain animal products. And the last thing that held me was my belief around spirituality. And so, of course, in my culture, there's a belief that we respect the animal sacrifice. And this is sort of an agreement, I guess, that we made with our animal relatives that we would we needed to eat their flesh. At the time, probably the nomadic tribes really did. And in return we would honor their sacrifice, right? And you can see huge all kinds of examples of this, right? For example, wearing animal furs or feathers. Of course, this is honoring, from an Indigenous perspective, this is honoring the life of an animal who died, right? It's using it's keeping their energy alive in a ceremonial way.
Right. Can I just interject that I've been to powwows, and that's what it looks like to me is that the dances are somehow honoring the spirits and evoking the spirits of the animals as people are dressed in all the regalia. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So I think I probably didn't have the language really to express it very well, but years later, like just in the last few years, I actually heard Dr. Margaret Robinson speaking about
Mm.
her way of describing this sort of phenomenon of like how it's not so much a spiritual exchange anymore, And she just simply says, you know, when we go into the grocery store, we're not leaving an offering of tobacco when we buy the ground beef. Like, it's that piece of it is missing now. And my experience was actually, I was watching a documentary about the narwhal. And when I saw the narwhal getting killed, getting slaughtered, I realized that there wasn't any spiritual ceremony, even in a very traditional culture. And I thought to myself, I think that I'm using that as my final excuse. And it really was like the moment, even though I think it still took some time for me to fully commit to veganism. That was the moment where I knew I was going to be vegan, you know, that I didn't have any reason not to be anymore.
Right, and I can imagine that that is a big challenge because, as you know, you've mentioned the connection between the relationship of animals and the land and the ancestral experience is what defines First Nations people, right? So I can imagine it must be for a lot of people that giving up the consumption of animals is like giving up their identity in some way.
Yeah, for sure. I think for most people who go vegan, that's true. I mean, all of us have so many attachments to our sort of traditional foods, right? That becomes such a central part of the way that we sort of define our cultures. And that's totally normal. But what I like to say is that these are different times than when we first made those agreements with our animal relatives. And in these times, even the most animal heavy diets that happen in Indigenous cultures, um, those Indigenous people would say, we know that we need to preserve and protect animals because they are threatened as well. I mean, the animals of North America were as much affected by colonialism as the Indigenous people. Or, you know, the bison, for example, those populations are still recovering. They basically live on reserves now. They don't have freedom the way that they used to. They're still being, I just read an article a couple of days ago about an open season on the bison in the States, because, and again, that's managing populations for ranches. So I think that, like in Alberta, there's actually a bison treaty that's been written, the Buffalo Treaty, and it's Indigenous groups that came together to protect the bison because they know that they're threatened people. That, I mean, all over the world, if you look into Indigenous um, communities that are reliant on animals, they know that these populations are threatened too. So
Right, the
I think
salmon
I
on the
think of my
west coast.
culture as a living culture. So my living culture can adapt and adjust, and just like I can fight to protect water, I can fight to protect animals.
Right
Sorry,
on.
I cut you off.
That's okay. No, I was thinking about the salmon here on the west coast, right?
Mhm.
And yeah, I know there are people here who kind of define themselves as Indigenous allies, and so they participate in ceremonies for the salmon, and that involves consuming them, and and so I'm sort of at a place where I think, I just want to run this by you. So, like, if I was an Indigenous person and knowing what's going on in the world and knowing how animals are treated in slaughterhouses and factory farms, and even the locavore story that we're told that we can graze animals and then kill them humanely, as you mentioned, that involves killing all the wild animals who are going to try to encroach on the lands. It involves clearing the lands, cutting down the rainforest so that there can be room for these animals to grow. So, even that in the long term it's not sustainable. But so I think, well, if I was an Indigenous person and I really felt that I needed to hunt or whatever, trap, fish to maintain that connection, it still doesn't mean that I can go to the store and buy leather shoes. Do you know what I mean? Like, is it possible to like be vegan except for just that hunting piece? Is that a thing, or do you feel like, I don't know.
I mean, I think that could be a thing, but I don't think I would call it being vegan.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And I'm certainly in no place to tell other people what to do, but we are in this situation where we're facing this existential crisis of climate catastrophe, and And so it's I think upon us to all to think about different ways that we can live in harmony. And so then as an animal activist, so it sounds, you go and you bear witness, and you were at the Excelsior Hog Farm, which just had its 2-year anniversary. Did you? So I want to talk about like the trauma of being an animal activist, but I'm interested in some of your activism first. So did you travel with your family intentionally to go to that protest?
No. My husband Jordan is from the Lower Mainland, and his dad lives in the Lower Mainland. So we were there anyways for an Easter break. And it just so happened that we were able to extend our stay long enough to be able to attend.
Okay. And what did you witness there?
Well, our family stood on the outside, so we were part of the like support and like the public face, I guess, of what was happening in the barns. So we got up quite early and rode on buses out to the site and set up. We were holding signs that had lots of good information on them about what was going on inside. And we were live streaming and singing the Liberation song over and over. And it was really powerful. And then as the day went on, the farmers actually started to gather in front of their farm. And like farmers were coming from all over with food. The kids were playing in the yard. Ultimately, they put up a sign saying that they loved their farm. It was such a bizarre contrast, and just such a lack of any sort of connection with what we were standing there doing. Like me with my kids, watching them with their kids. It was just such a strange feeling I often wondered what those children were thinking, because it was probably the first time they had ever had their lifestyle questioned in such an incredibly massive way,
Mm-hmm.
right? And to see so many people standing up against it, I just think it must have been such a strange experience for them, for the kids. But it was very powerful. That piece was very powerful. And I think the most powerful moment for me was definitely when the large group of activists started to like just pour off this farm in rows and rows, and everybody was just singing liberation, and like tears were pouring down our faces, and everyone, like the people who were coming out, were just like sobbing, and you could just see like the horror on their face of what they'd witnessed, because like us on the outside, we saw some of the live streams that were coming from the inside, and we could see that it was terrible. But there's nothing like the full visceral experience of being immersed in the sights, the sounds, the smells, the like the nervousness about the police not having access to washrooms, like just all being hungry, being tired, being too warm, being uncomfortable, all those pieces that come together. It was a lot to witness them experiencing that. Yeah, it was a powerful day. And that was the first Meet the Victims in Canada. So that was also really, really good to be able to be a part of. That was really good for our family.
Yeah. Yeah, that brought up a memory of a former workmate of mine who grew up in Saskatchewan on a farm, and he would tell me stories about how a lot of his family bonding was around animal slaughter, actually. So the chicken slaughter, for example, and the he had a large extended family apparently, and so they would all come together, and the children had their role in the process, and everybody did their part, and that was his memory of a family event. But I think his family, it wasn't a factory farm, it was a family farm. And these children that you're talking about, I saw some of the video of what went on inside there, and little baby piglets just laying on cement, shaking and obviously dying. How are the children like, how do you grow up with that kind of trauma? And, how does that impact those kids, right?
Yeah, that conditioning is so powerful. It really is. I also, when I was about 5 years old, I was invited over to a family's chicken slaughtering, and it was in their backyard. It wasn't a big factory farm either, but you're taught right away to remove yourself from the animal, right? I mean, it's it's laughing at an animal when they're experiencing something that's like, obviously, I mean, I can't even call it extreme distress. It's like the last moments of their nervous system when they're running around after they've been decapitated. And that that's not funny. There's nothing humorous about that. And yet they taught a 5-year-old version of me that this is something that I should laugh at. I should separate myself from the fact that there's a living being whose life has just been ended, not experience the emotion, the correct emotion for that situation, right? Which is, I mean, any other bird, if you find a bird dead in your front yard, you feel a sense of sadness for that bird, right? You feel like, is there a way I could have prevented this? You want to find solutions. You want, if you can help, if the bird's just injured, you want to help the bird. Those are the normal emotions that I should have been experiencing. But at 5 years old, they were already conditioning me to experience, this is funny, right? This is a joke. This is fun for all of us to gather and watch this hilarious event. And so the programming starts very young.
It does. And it's hard to go against it because everybody's doing it and you're dependent on these people and they're teaching you that. My same friend also told me a story about calves. So he was a witness to a birthing of a calf, and he at a quite young age, and he was able to name the calf, and the calf grew up, and he took care of the calf, and then the calf went to slaughter. And as he was telling me this story, he started to kind of tear up. And then he quickly, you could see, oh no, adjust, adjust, don't do that. And then he told me how after that, they were never able to name their cattle anymore, or any of the animals. They were called sirloin or round tip or whatever the different,
Right.
right? So that they were
Yeah.
conditioned to know that one day this was the cow's destiny. So
Yeah.
no point in,
And shut off those emotions, shut off the
right?
feelings that are normal for some animals.
Yeah, and so violence then becomes normal. And so what does that do? Like in your experience, with psychology and social work, what does that do in our body and our nervous system?
Well, I think that we're still experiencing the actual emotions, just like you said with your friend. The sadness still came up when he was talking about this. I mean, this is a memory from childhood, and he's still getting emotional about it. It's been sitting there that whole time. And it kind of gets piled up and stacked inside, and it takes a lot of energy to keep stuffing that down. And honestly, I think that sometimes it just contributes to this situation where you're using all your energy to hold in these natural emotions so that you can be living in a society that is a violent society that sort of glamorizes violence. And I think that it's part of the reason that we see so much stress and anxiety in our society is because we're constantly suppressing emotions and not releasing them in healthy ways. It's coming out maybe as anger, or maybe drinking, or maybe as maybe it's depression, that, and you can't really pinpoint what it is, but there's just something that's not feeling right, you know?
Right. And as you mentioned in the Animal Justice Academy video that you presented, for animal activists, there's no end. Like there's no end to this suffering, and it's going on 24/7. And the people that we love and our family, our friends who haven't yet made the switch to vegan, they're knowingly and willingly participating in it. It seems like, and so Claire Mann calls this dystopia, and we're doing everything we can, and we try to talk to them gently, and then we try to talk to them with anger, and we try to, and eventually, it just becomes throw your hands up and find your vegan tribe, because they're the only ones that really understand what this is like. I haven't borne witness. I don't have a car, and I live in a kind of a little bubble here even before COVID. But I watch the videos, right? and even that is traumatizing. I can't even imagine what it's like to go and actually witness that. So maybe do you want to share what that's like? I mean, you kind of have a little bit. And then how do animal activists, how should we cope with that trauma?
Right. Sure. Yeah. The first time that I went to bear witness was actually at a Toronto Pig Save vigil. And they, of course, they have truck after truck full of pigs that they stop, or they were at the time, that was several years ago now. I think things have shifted a little bit with gag legislation and COVID. But I actually was there with my husband and my daughter, and I think that I only approached one truck. It's a very overwhelming experience to see so many sentient beings in such obvious distress, and yet at the same time have it be like just like so normal, like just like a truck driving by on the street, you know, and people like that on that day. Actually, there was lots of people honking and swearing. I think that's pretty standard at that location at Fearman's Pork. And actually somebody threw a piece of bacon at us that day.
Wow.
Yeah. So there's this like real sense that you're standing up against sort of the normalized view of what's happening, and you're identifying this truck as being something different than the average truck on the road. But then there's this other process happening of connection one-on-one with animals, and this sense of hopelessness and powerlessness, because they're like minutes away from the end of their life, and up to this point they've only ever suffered. So in that moment that you get with them, you get the only opportunity for them to ever experience any kindness, gentleness, of love, and care. There's no other moment in their life that they've probably ever experienced those things. And for me, that's what the important piece was about bearing witness, that I was able to extend that to a living being in their last moments. And I think, again, it probably does connect back to my Indigenous values, in the sense that I believe animals are relations, right? And if anyone who was my relation was suffering like that, I would go to them, and I would offer them water. I would offer them words of comfort. It's natural to do that. And I think not only vegans do that, there's thousands of videos on the internet of people helping animals in distress, right? And some of them are hunters. I've seen videos of hunters helping a moose get free from falling through the ice. And those same hunters are probably going to be targeting that same moose later when it's hunting season, you know, because it's our natural instinct to go to an animal and help them when they're in distress, because we are connected at such a deep level. But so since then, I've been across Canada bearing witness. I've gone lots of places. Not everywhere can you have such a close, intimate connection with the animals. For instance, here in Saskatchewan at Regina Pig Save, the trucks won't stop for us. So we kind of catch a glimpse for them as they're backing up into the place where they're unloaded. And then we can actually stand at the fence and hear their distress and document their distress as they're being unloaded. But we can't make eye contact. We can't, really, other than just telling them, we're sorry this is happening to them. There's not much really that we can do to offer solace or comfort. And in Saskatoon, at Save Movement Saskatoon, that's a chicken slaughterhouse, and turkeys, but it's mostly chickens that come through. Same thing. The tarps are usually down. Like, there's not that same individual connection that you can have at some places. So, yeah. I know there was a second part to the question and I can't remember what it was. So.
I can't either. How do we process that? So how, afterwards, is there sort of a group? Do you guys?
I think this is an important piece. Of course, everybody has their own way of processing. And I think that's important. So I think, first of all, what you want to do as an activist is really very self-reflective, like really start to get to know yourself and what are the things that have what impact on you. For myself, as a survivor of trauma personally, I tend to already be in a bit of a dissociated state when I go into that kind of a situation. Like, I know as my stress level comes up, I kind of go to this other place, and it's still and quiet, and it feels like there's not a lot of emotion there. But of course, all that emotion is happening under the surface. So I still have to deal with it at some point. But in the moment, I'm pretty good. Other people in the moment really feel a lot of that emotion coming through. And I think what we need to be doing, so first of all, the self-awareness, so that we know how we process these kinds of things, which sometimes we won't know until we're there. And then also what helps us when we're stressed or worried. What are the things that are our go-tos for taking care of ourselves? And then the other piece that I think is really important as a movement is building a community that helps have those supports. And Patrice Jones in her book Aftershock talks about having sanctuary, having a place of sanctuary. When I do trauma work, I always tell people that the way that you know you've resolved trauma is when you feel safe, right? And so because Patrice Jones says there's no way for us to create a feeling of absolute safety in our society now because of this culture of violence and trauma that we live in. But we can create places of sanctuary. And I think as a movement, these are the things that we want to be doing. We want to be creating those places of sanctuary. So maybe we won't be able to say the exact right things to a person, but we can be that safe person, or we can help to create ways for us to collectively express what we went through. And actually that was something that did happen after Meet the Victims, was we all went together to an actual sanctuary and had some food together and kind of processed the event as best we could, talked about what was going to happen next and things like that. And not everybody opted to go because everyone's different. You know, some people needed the time and space to do some work themselves first. And I think, you know, there were possibly some other things we could have done that would have been helpful too. You know, you learn as you go.
So going to like a farm rescue sanctuary where animals are just living happily in their own way, and you know that nobody's going to exploit them, and that people are there to take care of them. Even going to the Facebook groups and
Yeah,
watching
that could
these
be a really
animals.
nice counterbalance.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And I find I'm so thankful for social media. And, you know, although it's being sort of co opted by the dominant culture, and who knows how long we'll have access to it, it's being co opted by corporations, I should say, the corporate culture. But, you know, there's places like the Vistopia support groups and stuff like that. And it's interesting that, you know, I mean, vegans, we're all sorts of different people, and we have different political opinions, and I don't always agree with everyone that I meet, but there's this foundation, right, that we understand. We know what's going on with the animals. We've removed ourselves from it. And it's a very strong foundation, it feels like.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a good foundation too. And the thing is, you don't have to always agree with everybody to be able to be supportive of each other. You know, I think it's not about, it's not necessarily about debating our values. It's just about sitting with each other in our pain, you know, and just validating and normalizing that these are the natural responses to seeing that kind of distress, and that witnessing of distress is actually causing our own distress,
Right. So that's kind of
and that's normal.
that's so the vegan community is kind of a safe place. That's a place where we can feel that sense of
Yeah,
safety in a way.
that's that's what
Yeah.
we want. We want
Yeah.
a community that feels safe, that feels like a sanctuary itself. Yeah.
Right, right. Okay, so just to add to these layers of trauma that we're talking about, so now we've got the climate crisis, we've got all the ancestral history of colonization and genocide, we've got the trauma ongoingly of knowing what's going on with the animals. Now we've got COVID as well, just to add to the mix. And so it looks like you participated in the Eating Animals Creates Pandemics
Yeah. Yep.
action on May 1st. What was that like?
Well, I wasn't able to go May 1st, actually. I participated in other actions with Eating Animals Causes Pandemics prior to that. But because of COVID, I wasn't able to go on May 1st, because in Saskatchewan right now, they're really trying to encourage us to stay within our own communities, and especially not go to the big centers that have more variants of concern. So both my husband and I work in health, and we didn't want to risk it. So we didn't go. Um, I can't say how that event was, but I can say that other ones have been very powerful. It's a really well put together event, in the sense that all the resources are available, and it's worth reaching out to them if you're interested in doing one. They're easy to set up. It doesn't take a lot of people. And I think what they're talking about is so critical, is that when you hear about the pandemic, mostly we're talking about the like downstream sort of solutions, I guess. We're talking about vaccines, we're talking about masks, we're talking about hand washing, but we're not looking upstream to the causes. And those causes, in this case and in most cases of illness that have the potential to be pandemics, is some kind of way that we're exploiting animals. Those are the vectors of disease. That's zoonotic illness are the ones that are the most dangerous to us. So we need to stop using animals the way that we are. And yeah,
You
there's
know,
nothing good about it.
it's just occurring to me now that when the European ancestors brought disease to these lands, that the indigenous people were not resistant to them, and because their interaction with animals was quite different, so they probably had no exposure to these diseases because they weren't abusing animals in that
Right.
way. Isn't that
Yeah.
interesting? Right. Yeah, yeah, it's very scary, and it's really. I stood with a sign for a couple of hours, and we got some nice honks and thumbs up, and then other people sort of scoffing at us as if, "Oh, look at those silly people." Now we didn't have the professionally made signs. We didn't have the banner signs that other people did, and I think we need to do that, because if you're just standing with a handmade sign, you're not taken as seriously as if we had the professional signs. But yeah, I'd encourage people to go look at eating animals causes pandemic. Some of the protests around the world were quite moving. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I
Yeah.
think too, don't ever discount those scoffs. That's still a response, that's still somebody. It goes in there for them to have a response, and they probably haven't had that moment before, where they actually had to think about, is that something that I think is relevant? Even if they dismiss it, they've still had to think about it, which they've probably never done before. And that's a really important part of the activism, right? Is to get people processing it. They're not automatically always going to agree with us right away. In fact, most likely they are. I try to imagine myself as in my early adulthood, I'm sure I would have been somebody that would have scoffed at a protester, standing out with PETA or some of the other groups that were so popular back then, and really doing the out there outreach and activism. But yeah,
Eventually,
you
it
change,
yeah, it's
you learn
true,
more, and
right?
you grow.
That's right. Hopefully, yeah, hopefully in time. All right. So let's end on a happy note and talk about your little mini sanctuary there. I'm very interested in the rats. Now, have they been rescued from a testing situation, a lab environment?
No, none of the rats we have now are from a testing environment. No, we just rescued from a local, well, a Saskatchewan rat rescue called Charming Rat Rescue. It's in Regina, and she's got so many rats. I think people, mostly from pets, I think, and people just, they're such beautiful little creatures, and people just love having them. And but they also breed very quickly, and you have to be very careful about that. And I think that's why she just gets so many turned over to her. Um, so yeah, it's there's always a demand, I think, for foster homes and for adopters for these rats. Mhm.
Interesting. And so you've had them spayed and neutered. Is that the term for
No,
what?
we just have girls, so we don't have we
Okay.
didn't do that. Yeah.
So you don't have to worry about that.
No.
And what do you love about your rat friends?
Well, they're smart. They're hilarious. They're so smart. Like they just and so interactive. They're really brave. Like around the cats and dogs, they just are they're fearless. I mean, we have to be careful because 2 of the dogs we have now are rescue Jack Russell Terriers and they're not good with the rats at all. But yeah, I don't know what else to say about them. They're snuggly and sweet, and they're just like, they hold on to your finger, and they're just really interactive. I don't know. They're really beautiful animals. I love having them here.
Oh, and that's right. I'll just do that. And do the cats and the dogs, then they're kind of separated so that they're safe, but they interact a bit somehow?
The cats and the dogs are
And the
separated
rat
from the rats.
and the rats,
Oh
yeah.
we just have it set up so that they can each have their own spaces if necessary. But I mean, at times they're all in each other's space, and we just monitor. That's all. Yeah.
Oh, that must be very entertaining.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's wonderful.
Okay, and your kids then, they've grown up completely vegan?
Yeah. Yeah, they
That's
were all born vegans.
so cool.
Um, yeah, they're it is really cool. Parenting them has been really incredible. It's it's a totally different worldview for them than what my husband and I have, because like we grew up obviously for most of our lives not being vegan, but for them that's always been the only option, right? The only thing that they've known. And I shouldn't say the only option, but the only thing that they've known. And like the way that they frame it is so different, because like they don't see animal products as food. So like if their friend was to offer them something that wasn't vegan, they would just be like, well, no, because I don't eat that. That's not because we can't have an animal and a product or food that's almost exactly the same, but they just don't eat animals. You know, it's so simple for them to not be like. I always say that Jordan and I were kind of apologists at first, you know, kind of like making room for family and friends and sort of saying like, well, we understand, you know, everybody has their own journey, that kind of thing. And not that our kids are rude or anything like that, but they're just very clear that that's not an option. It's not an option. It's nothing they would ever consider. It's really cool to watch. And I learned from them because of it.
Right. Yeah, I heard
Mhm.
somebody say the other day that, you know, you ask someone sometime, do you remember the first time you decided to eat an animal? Like, what was that like for you? And of course, none of us made that decision. We never
Right.
made that decision, except
Yeah.
maybe, kids who grow up vegan and then might make that decision, hopefully not, or um, but do they get pressure? Do they get pressure from other kids, or are they just really strong in how they feel healthy and they know, like you've taken them to vigil, so they know a lot of
Oh yeah, they're
stuff.
activists in their own right. I mean, they've been to every form of activism I think that you could think of. So yeah, they probably do get pressure. They don't see it that way. But sometimes I come home with stories where I would see it that way. And of course, I mean, the society itself is full of pressures. I mean, they still have a school milk program at my kids' school. They still have hot dog lunch days at my kids' school. So, you know, those pressures are there. Absolutely, they are. But we also live in a culture where, you know, there's lots of exceptions made generally, I think, for diets now. So that's helped them too. I think people kind of they can understand it from the sense of like, you know, like a gluten intolerance kind of thing. And that makes it makes it easier for them. They don't have to sort of challenge themselves to think about the real reason, which is that we avoid harming animals.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a little more accepted now in society than even 10 years ago. So
Yeah.
thank goodness.
Yeah.
And then finally, the food forest that you're creating. What is a food forest?
Well, okay, so we just bought some property 20 minutes from where we currently live. And what we're doing, it was already pretty well treed, like it had like a periphery of trees. And we're just adding in food trees into this ecosystem and rebuilding it as an ecosystem with some native plants and some other perennial kind of plants, as well as just like all kinds of different trees. So a food forest is like a 7 layer or 8 if you count mushrooms design, where you're looking at the roots, the plants that have long roots and that the root is the part that you use, and then the covers, and then the shrubs, and then the tree, and then the canopy tree. So right now we're focusing on adding in kind of almost all of those layers, really. But as we bought it last fall, and as we're exploring it now in the spring, we're noticing that there are some of these layers already in place. So it's really interesting to not just to build it and add to it, but to observe what's already there. And our hope is really to have it be pretty low maintenance in the longer term, and be able to, I mean, already there, before we got there was already lots of life on the property, like squirrels and pigeons and deer who come through, and bunnies and all that kind of stuff. So we don't want to like block them off from that. Like, we're not putting up big fences or anything like that. We just want to try to find a way to, like, if we had more space, we'd be looking at more like a rewilding kind of model. But because we only have like 6.75 acres, so we're right now we're just looking at building the food forest itself, and maybe someday we'll be able to get more into a rewilding system.
Wow, what a wonderful project. That sounds fantastic. All right. Well, thank you so much, Shawna, for taking the time today. Really wonderful to meet you. Is there anything that you want to leave us with as we go?
Yeah, I think the one thing that I always say to people is that if you're considering getting active in the animal rights movement, I think that you should just do so. Just the way that I got active, I always say I started before I was ready. It's a phrase I think I stole from Marie Forleo. And the piece that I want people to know is that the movement needs you. Like, as an individual, they need you, but they also need all of us. So whatever skills you can bring to it is exactly what is needed. And but also more of us need to be there, right? More of us need to be present, just because the more it grows, the more community we can grow, and the more we can show that this is a viable alternative to what's happening right now.
Right. Yeah. All right. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you.